All right, everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the second in our three-part series, Evergreen Exteriors, where we are exploring the outside of the Evergreen Museum and Library. My name is Lori Finkelstein. I am the director and curator at the Evergreen Museum and Library, and I'm thrilled today to be hosting this talk for all of you. This event is sponsored by the Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity Group at Hopkins, which is part of the Office of Alumni Affairs and the Evergreen Museum and Library. We are very grateful for support from JHU Sheridan Libraries, the Evergreen House Foundation, and JHU Museum members for all the support that you give to the Evergreen Museum and Library. And as a good director of a museum, I would be remiss if I did not encourage those of you who are not museum members to please consider supporting the museum. Although we are closed, we are working hard thinking about new programs and exciting events and opportunities to offer to our communities when we reopen. And members will be the first to know about these and will have wonderful opportunities to join us. So please do consider becoming museum members. For today's talk, I'm going to be speaking for a good portion of it, but then I do hope to be able to open it to questions towards the end, and I do hope that you jump in with your questions, and I will try my hardest to answer them. Please note that the chat function has been turned off, but questions can be posted in the Q&A section of the Zoom. And before I get started, I want to extend one more thank you to several of my colleagues, to Jamie Seward from Alumni Affairs, to Amy Mulville and Carolyn Jelovich from the Development Office at the libraries, and also to my colleague Ben Renwick, who is the Operations and Facilities Coordinator for Evergreen, who I tortured with many questions these past couple of weeks as I was putting this talk together. So thank you to all of you for making this possible, and let's get started. All right, so today's talk is a look at the architecture of Evergreen through different lenses. For those of you who are familiar with the museum, the photos on the screen are what you see when you come to visit us inside. And I've put together just a little collage here of some of the better known aspects of the museum. The museum is known for its collections of 19th and early 20th century decorative arts and paintings. It's known for its theater. It is known for the Garrett Library, which is pictured here. And it is also known for its collection of early 20th century paintings. For those of you who are not familiar with the museum, a really quick overview, I'll provide you a really quick overview right now. So the museum was the home originally of two generations of the Garrett family, who were wealthy industrialists from Baltimore, and they lived in the house between 1878 and 1952, two separate generations. In 1941, John Work Garrett willed the house and his collection to Johns Hopkins University, and his wife Alice Warder Garrett, who outlived him by about another 10 years, willed her collection to the Evergreen House Foundation. So today, the Evergreen Museum and Library is owned by Johns Hopkins University, and it has a partnership with the Evergreen House Foundation. And the two entities, the university and the foundation, have ownership of two collections inside the museum, with a collection belonging to the university and a collection belonging to the foundation. So it has been a museum since the 1980s, and over the years, we have expanded our tours and our programs for the public. However, when we give tours of the museum, we don't generally take people on tours of the outside of the museum. You can get a takeaway handout that will tell you a little bit about the architecture, but we don't talk too much about the architecture of the building. And as I mentioned last week, for those of you who joined us for the garden talk, one of the things I said was that when we were told to mostly work from home during the pandemic, I felt that there was a real opportunity to explore facets of our collection that we wouldn't normally explore when we were in the building. And one of those facets is our largest collection object, the building itself. And so I've been spending quite a good amount of time researching the building, thinking more about the grounds, and that's what led me to put together today's talk. So you can take the building, you can take the outside of it, and you can use the architecture of the building to really, as I was saying before, look at some different lenses. You can see the house as a space for collections, as a space for family, as a space for entertaining, and a space also for workers. When you come on a tour of the museum, you really tend to have an experience that focuses on the museum as a space for collections. We talk a little bit about the family, and we definitely talk about the famous people who visited the Garretts at Evergreen, particularly in the 20th century when John Work Garrett, the ambassador, and his wife Alice were living there. We don't talk a lot about the workers, if at all. We have one small exhibit area that addresses them briefly, but today we're going to spend some time going into more detail on that as well. All right, the ever-expanding Evergreen, here we are. You see a photo on the left side of your screen, which is from 1866, less than 10 years after Evergreen was built. And Evergreen is a small, fairly square structure in what looks like a very bucolic wooded landscape. It was built, as I'll explain in a minute, in 1858 as an Italianate country villa. And on the right side of your screen, you see Evergreen somewhere between 1905 and 1920, and it is vast. You see the main original portion of the building here, and then you see on the left side a long bump out followed by a smaller bump out. And then towards the rear of the photo, you see all the greenhouses and garden structures that we talked about yesterday. So this bird's eye view really gives you a sense spatially, geographically, of how the building has expanded. I'm going to return to the photo on the right over again during the course of this talk today, and I'm going to pull out different facets of it that will help you understand how structurally Evergreen grew over time. All right, so we're today going to really focus on the 19th century expansions at Evergreen, and those were expansions and alterations to the house made by the first generations of Garretts to live there. T. Harrison Garrett and his wife Alice Whitridge Garrett. And this is a quote from the 2010 HABS report, the Historic American Building Structures report that was done for Evergreen from, which is where I pulled a lot of the information for this talk from. And in the report, there's this great quote that says, as you can see, during the years that the Garrett family owned and occupied Evergreen, the house was under almost constant renovation. So this is a house that changed a lot. In the period I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about changes that were made when T. Harrison Garrett and Alice Whitridge Garrett were alive and living there together. And then I'm also going to talk about some changes that Alice made herself when she was a widow following her husband's death in 1888. The photo that you see on this screen is one of our favorites at the museum, because on the left side of the photo, which is the north side of the building, you see a porch on the side, which no longer exists. It was replaced for a new northern entrance. And if you look closely, there's like an evergreen tree, and behind that is possibly another side entrance. So a really great photo that shows the side of the house as it was originally when it was built, we think in 1858. What you probably can't see on your screen unless you pull yourself really close like I am is the three sons of Alice and T. Harrison Garrett who lived in the house. Horatio Garrett, Robert Garrett, and John Work Garrett were the three boys who grew up there, and they're standing right in front of that north side entrance. So this is a timeline overview of the house. I could probably keep you on here with me for like 6 to 8 hours easy going through all of this. Perhaps you're going to want to have dinner at some point. I'm going to try and limit this to an hour. So take a look at this slide. And again, I'm going to come back to the diagram a few times during the course of this talk. And on the left, I really bulleted out really quickly for you the main periods of transition at the house. 1858 is when it's built as an Italianate and Greek revival structure by the architect John Hogg. 1882 to 1886 are the first series of changes that the Garretts made by the architects J.A. and W.T. Wilson, and also by Charles L. Carson. 1895 to 1906, those are the changes that Alice makes when she's a widow by Renwick, Aspinwall, and Owen as architects. And then between the 1920s and the 1940s, there are some colonial revival enhancements to the house, and those are made by Lawrence Hall Fowler that will be the focus of next week's talk. So I will mention that one of the things that's quite relevant or influential about Evergreen is the fact that for the most part, the architects who worked on the house were local Baltimore architects, with the exception of Renwick, Aspinwall, and Owen. That architecture firm was from New York. But all the others you see listed were local. Carson was a Micah alum, for example, and I believe worked on the Lovely Lane Church on St. Paul Street, and Lawrence Hall Fowler, of course, also a native son, and we will learn more about him next week. All right, here's the house at the time it was built. Circa 1857, 1858, it was known as Glen Mary, built by a local architect, as I mentioned, and it is essentially a square structure with a bump out at the end. You can see on the top, there's a cupola, which is later removed. I'll mention that. You can see the anthemiums. I had to practice saying that about 15 times. I don't think I got it right. Anthemians. And also the Corinthian columns. If you look on the right side of the screen, that's the bump out that I'm talking about, where I put my little arrow. And that was a structure where the kitchen likely was and where there were likely some servants' quarters as well. And then I've also put up here for you to see some contemporary versions of those architectural details, the columns and the anthemians, which are the honeycomb, the sort of floral looking decorations at the very top of the house. Okay, so taking you between 1858 and I'm now going to take you to 1982, and in between is when the Garrett family moves in. The Broadbent family lives there for a short period of time. In the 1860s and 1870s, the house changes hands several times, and by 1878, T. Harrison Garrett and Alice Whitridge Garrett move in with their 3 sons. And one of the first changes they make to the house is the addition of indoor bathrooms. So architectural records indicate that there was at least 1 indoor bathroom in the house in 1858, but the Garretts add 3 more. They add 2 on the south side of the house, which I have circled for you, and then they add another bay window like that to accommodate a bathroom on the north side. So I've circled those 2 on the south side for you. And they're essentially bay windows used to house interior bathrooms with interior plumbing. We know that there was also outhouses on the property early on, but by the 1880s, inside plumbing is really something that elite people expect to have in their homes. But keep in mind that at this period in time, only a very small percentage of Baltimoreans in general had indoor plumbing. One of the selling points for the development of Roland Park, which is the neighborhood surrounding Evergreen, which was developed in the mid 1890s until the early 1900s, was that the homes there were built with indoor plumbing. And that was considered novel, and as I said, a selling point. So this was quite a luxury for people to have at the time. And someone can hop into the Q&A after and correct me, please, if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Baltimore sewer system was not developed until 1904, until after the Great Fire. Keep in mind that Evergreen in 1882 was still part of Baltimore County. The neighborhood where Evergreen is located and where Roland Park is located was not annexed onto the city until I think 1916. All right, so bathrooms were added for family living. What else did the Garretts do to make their house accommodating for entertainment? Well, they added a dining room. You can see that on the left side of the photo. It's the rather large bay window that's popping out. And that was a new dining space that was added on with a conservatory window. It had a place for people to sit. Those window panes that you see were large, and they were likely either a stained glass or a colored leaded glass. And inside the house, there was a new passageway created to allow the staff that serviced the dining room to pass into a butler's pantry that was added shortly later and into the kitchen. So if you look at that left side photo, you see this sort of first addition, this addition of a new dining room. But Spaces for entertainment don't really function in homes for the elite unless they're accommodated by spaces for service and for workers. And so you can see on the left and center side of the photo what is essentially a mishmash of back service doors. And this was meant to accommodate the staff who worked in the house. So I do want to mention that this photo that you see here does not date to 1883 or 1884. It is a later photo. It's a photo that probably dates somewhere between 1895 and 1924. And it's one, again, that I'm going to refer to a few times during the course of this talk because it fascinates me for a few reasons. One, the dining room, as we'll talk about in a little bit, is no longer there. That bay window's been removed. The structure on top of it, which I'll get to in a minute, is no longer there. It's been removed. But also because the back of the house is actually not that attractive. And as we talked about during the garden talk last week, the idea was that you would be in the house looking out at the lovely gardens, or perhaps exploring the gardens. But the view from the gardens at the back of the house was not especially attractive. You can see various doors of entry on the piece that bumps out on the side where my middle arrow is. And you also see another door for entry to a kitchen right at the back. That's where there was an ice house back there. And I wasn't able to illustrate it on the photo, but if you see the arched entranceway, if you were to pass through that, there was yet another entrance to the back of the house that way. So mishmash is not actually an architectural term. It's hard to see if anyone finds me amusing, so I might cut the jokes, but I thought that was the best I could do to kind of describe a bit of a discrepancy between, you know, the front of the house and the back of the house. Right? This is where your guests are entering. This is where your staff is entering. This is where service is happening. This is the interior. So that bay window over there, that is the leaded glass window. That would have been a window where the dining room was. And the photo on the right is the dining room, high Victoriana, Moorish elements, wallpaper, heavily carved wood furniture. And then the photo on the left is what is there today. That is the reading room in the Evergreen Museum today. And we will talk about the renovation of the space and the creation of this room next week. It is a 20th century addition to the house from the 1920s. So on the left, you have the 1920s, and on the right, you have the 1880s dining room. So we've talked a little bit about the house as a space for family. We've talked a little bit about the house as a space for workers. We'll get to that more in a moment. The house was also a space that was designed for collections. Both generations of Garretts who lived in the house were collectors. They were collectors of books and prints and paintings and Asian porcelain and a variety of textiles and decorative arts. And if you were to come on a tour of the museum, that's what we would focus on. We would really focus on that collecting. And I was kind of tempted to try and give this talk without putting in any interior photos at all, to see if I could still tell a compelling story just by looking at the outside of the building. But I did decide to include a few. The dining room one that you saw, because it's super cool to think that those two spaces are essentially the same, though of course there's been transformations between the two time periods that we can go into more in the Q&A if anyone is interested. But also because I think it's hard to talk about House of Collectors if you don't show their collection a little bit. And the space you're seeing here is an example of a renovation that was made between 1884 and 1886 to the top floor of the house. We scoot back here, you'll see that cupola. We go here. The cupola is gone. It is replaced by a skylight. And we think that T. Harrison Garrett intended to turn this space into an area to display his growing collection of books and prints. We know that a couple of years earlier, he had installed bookcases all along the second floor of the house, so right underneath what you're looking at now, and then turned his attention to this space. And it resembles the collection spaces of other prominent collectors in the United States. So he was definitely borrowing from a popular aesthetic. And to me, it's incredibly interesting to think about that as a museum person. It's incredibly interesting for me to think about this idea of someone using their private residence and their personal collection as an opportunity to make their works public. Not public to everyone, but public to select friends and colleagues and associates who would be welcomed into this space to see and appreciate the collections. And this idea of being able to have the means to architecturally change your house to provide a home for your collections with the idea of inviting outsiders in to see them really fascinates me, and I think is one of the very important story threads that runs throughout Evergreen. All right, 1885 to 1886. This is the really major transformation that T. Harrison Garrett and Alice Garrett bring to Evergreen. They add in this time period the green space in the house. So just to orient you a little bit, the blue space is the original house, right? That square, portico on the front steps, and the bump out, that L on the back. And then this green space, so sort of the L that you see, gets added between 1885 and 1886. It's when the porte cochere gets added, and it creates a wing, that long piece that's jutting out, a servant's wing. It creates a billiard room. It creates a gymnasium on top of the billiard room for the three Garrett sons to exercise and also have homeschooling from a teacher who lived with them. And it creates a passageway between the two houses that allows people to pull up in a carriage and enter the home under cover. And then of course on the right of your screen, I've highlighted for you the aerial view of that same space. So it's a major neo-Romanesque arches renovation to the house by local architect Charles L. Carson, who I mentioned before. It nearly doubles the size of the house. It adds bathrooms on the second and third floors, the billiard room, gymnasium, and schoolroom, and other features as well. And in the photo you see here, which is a contemporary photo, you can see that porte cochere, you can see the U-shaped courtyard for visitors, and on top of it, guest rooms are added. So on that bridge between the two spaces, you can see the addition of guest rooms on the outside. A small addition to the house that was made around the same time period was a conservatory on the exterior of the house. You can see it where my arrow is. That's it in the winter, I believe, because the panes of glass have been taken down and you just see the structure. I will say that during last week's talk, we erroneously used the image on the right, which is the interior of the conservatory, as an example of what the greenhouses looked like on the inside. We have no pictures of the inside of the greenhouses, and we plopped this one in by accident. But what it really was, the photo you see on your right, was the interior of what you see on the left. And it was designed by Alice Whitridge Garrett. As many of you heard last week, she was an ardent gardener. And this does make a good sort of justification of the points we were talking about last week of this very Victorian desire to bring the outside inside. When I think of Victorian design, I think of ferns and palms in the house. We believe there were no shortage of those at Evergreen from photos, and you can see some here. You see a swinging, I want to call it a sofa. It's not a swinging sofa, a swinging bench. You see posts with vines on them, lamps, just really a lovely space. And if you look at the far end of the photo, of course, you see the exterior windows with the shutters of the house. And then on the left side of the photo, you see what was the passageway into the home, how you would have accessed the space. All right, in 1888, T. Harrison Garrett dies in a yachting accident. And the narrative at Evergreen goes that, along these lines, that his wife took her sons on a long trip, essentially packed up the house, closed it down, and lived with her sons at Princeton, where they attended university for a number of years. and she comes back to Evergreen some 10 years later, a little bit less. So there's one challenge with this narrative, and it is this idea that no one lived at Evergreen during that time period. I'm not convinced by that. This is an incredibly large home, and I cannot imagine that there were not some caregivers and some caretakers, not caregivers, that there were not some caretakers of the home. I tried to solve this mystery by looking in the 1890 census to see who might have been living in Evergreen during this time period. And alas, the 1890 census is that census, as some of you may know, that mostly all burned in a fire, and there are no Maryland federal census records for 1890. So it is still a mystery as to who might have lived in the home when Alice and her 3 sons were not there. And I'm going to be working hard to solve this mystery, because I think if you want to start to really dig into the different histories of the house and share those histories through different perspectives, knowing what it might have been like to live there when the mistress of the house and her 3 sons were not there would lend itself, I think, to some very compelling narratives. But we just don't know right now. Those are all storylines we're going to be pursuing. And again, really with the goal of trying to understand Evergreen, not just through the eyes of the people who owned it and the people who were entertained there, but also through the eyes and labor of all the people who made the food and the cleaning and the elite living there possible. So here we are, 1895 to 1906. We're looking at the changes that Alice made to Evergreen when she returned back after having been away for a number of years. And those changes are where you see my arrow pointing to the bump out, small new entranceway is added. And she adds extensive new servants' wings in 2 installments. And also at the very tip of that light purple addition, she adds a new entrance into the servants' wings. So the new north entranceway that I mentioned, just to go back, that's where I keep pointing at my screen myself with my finger as if you could see it. The arrow that you can see pointing to the yellow bump out, that's what you see over here. It is a new entranceway for visitors to come into Evergreen. It's where visitors to the museum enter now, and it's where Alice would have had her guests visit Evergreen. On the inside, she added and changed. She changed the location of the staircase, and she added a much more ornate large staircase with a more formal landing. We believe that she had musical performances on the 2nd floor landing. And this was really meant to be a restart, a reboot to Evergreen for Alice and her 3 sons, a way to re-enter Baltimore society, figuratively by their presence there, but also literally through the house, through a new entrance. The glass structure that you see over this ornately plastered entrance is a Tiffany wrought iron and glass canopy that was recently restored. And last year, when I first joined Evergreen, we were lucky enough to have the people who worked on it give a wonderful talk about the restoration work that they did to the canopy. So soon after that north entrance was added, Alice added a new staff wing. So if we go back to our diagram here, Alice and her husband added that green service wing in the 1880s. And then Alice adds, bumped up behind it in 2 installments, additional servants space. And this is a space for which we don't know the architect, but some of the architectural reports that we have of the house indicate that it was actually not the best executed of all the additions to Evergreen. The roof lines are uneven, they don't line up perfectly. There's not the best construction. Though it did add additional storage space to the house. It added a new bathroom for men servants, 2 new bathrooms for women servants, and additional living quarters for servants in general, with a separation of men and women. And I want to pause here and I want to talk just a little bit about who were these servants who were at Evergreen in the early 1900s, and what do we know in general about the workers for whom an enormous amount of architectural space was created for at Evergreen. So there's a little irony there when you start to dig into the census. And the census don't tell us everything, but in terms of research, it's where we are right now. I will say if there's anyone on this webinar who themselves have family members or people they know who might have worked at Evergreen, we would love to hear from you. Periodically, people do reach out to us with fascinating stories. We know a bit about the Bresci family who lived at Evergreen with Alice in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but we really don't know much about people who lived and worked at Evergreen before then. So, except for what's in the census. And the irony is that when the house was its smallest, back when the Broadbents lived there, before all these servant wings were added, the census indicate that that's when the largest number of servants were at Evergreen. 12 domestic workers and laborers were at Evergreen according to the 1860 census. And then if we go to the give me 1 second here, folks. Sorry, if we go to the 1880 census, there's only 5 servants listed as working in the house. The 1890 census, as we discussed, was burned. The 1900 census only had 8 employees. I could not find anything in the 1910 or the 1920 census. So the records are not telling us the full story. Why would you be building so many workspaces if the census are indicating that not that many people are living there? And I will argue that the answer lies in the fact that what I suspect was that for the workers, this was not their primary residence, that they are being recorded elsewhere for census purposes. Again, a lot more research needs to be done. A lot more research also needs to be done on who these servants were and who these workers were. We know from census materials that some were native-born Marylanders, white. We know that some were Irish immigrants and some German immigrants. We also know that some were native-born Marylanders who were Black. Inventories of house rooms at Evergreen tell us that by the early 1900s, the dining spaces for the staff were segregated. There was a dining space for white workers to eat, and there was a dining space for Black workers to eat in. And this is not surprising. This is the same time that Roland Park, the neighborhood around Evergreen, is being developed. And as many of you may know, Roland Park was known for its very restrictive covenants that did not allow people of color to buy homes, though a caveat was made that Black domestic servants could work in the homes. So there was, and there's been a lot of history written about this, and we are at Evergreen working to explore it further. So what we suspect is that there were servants who lived at Evergreen, but also a large number of servants and workers who worked there but did not live there. So let's talk a little bit more about workers' housing, and I want to use this aerial view again. So here we're back to that original aerial view, and that's showing you the house and it's showing you all the greenhouses. But look at that far back corner where my yellow circle is. I've highlighted it on the other photo. That is a building that's no longer there. Ben Renwick, my colleague who I mentioned earlier, and I have been trying to figure out what this was. I'm going to show you another slide in a minute. We think uncovers the mystery. Ben and I stomped around the woods earlier last week where we think this house was located, and we are pretty sure that this was housing for workers. And workers also would have lived in the Carriage house, which is the structure to the right of, if you go back to the aerial view, the structure to the right of where all the greenhouses are. So we're pretty sure that people lived in the, we know that people lived in the Carriage house. We know that people lived in the house, and we suspect that people also lived on cottages on the grounds. If you recall, for those of you who were on the talk last week, we talked about Charles Uffler, the gardener who won prizes for Mrs. Garrett for his excellent cultivation of tomatoes and flowers. What we know about Charles Uffler personally comes from his wife's obituary in the Baltimore Sun, and it indicates that she died as a resident at Evergreen. So the Ufflers, as a couple, and perhaps their children were living somewhere on the grounds in the early 1900s when Charles was working for Alice. So census materials are rich sources of information for us, but they don't tell us everything. They can help us start to piece together the bigger picture of Evergreen, but more research needs to be done. So here's the last slide that I have for you before I sum it all up. And this slide shows two houses. And we think that one of these two houses is what is circled over here. And Ben and I are in a bit of disagreement because I think it is the one on the right because you can see the one-story addition on the side and the porch, but Ben was of the mind that it's the photo on the left. So we are going to be doing more work to try and do this, to try and do justice to the stories of the people whose lives and whose work at Evergreen has yet to be uncovered. I'm going to just summarize really quickly. I'm going to go back to this first slide here, and then we're going to take some questions. All right, so I started off by wanting to talk today with all of you about Evergreen as a space for collections and family and entertaining and workers. And ultimately, all these stories work together. They cannot function independently of each other. And I'm really looking forward to the opportunity during my time at Evergreen to dig in more to all of them and to start to share more with all of you about what we learned about how the house evolved to accommodate all the various needs of the Garrett family, and also how the house functioned as a home and a workspace for people whose stories we haven't discussed yet very much at all. So I'm going to open it now to questions. I'm grateful to all of you for listening. Thank you very much. And I'm very curious to hear what you have to say. So I'm going to open the question and answer tab at the top of my screen, and I'm just going to jump in and answer what I can. All right, awesome. I'm going to start with the one that makes me look really smart. The question was, you were right about the date of the Baltimore sewer system. So thank you. I thought I had it right, but I wasn't 100% sure. Were there slaves at Evergreen prior to the Civil War? Someone is asking a very important question, and I will tell you the very little bit that I know. There is a slave schedule, which is what the U.S. Federal Census Bureau called the separate enumeration of enslaved persons in 1860. So in 1860, there's two census. There is the U.S. Federal Census, and then there is a census that the federal government called the slave schedule. And that listing is a listing of enslaved individuals. It does not list these individuals by name. It lists the individuals who owned them. And in the 1860 census, there is a Stephen Broadbent who lived in the 9th district, which is Evergreen's district. And if I am reading this information correctly, it indicates that he owned two enslaved individuals. I have to do much more digging before I can confirm that that is true. And I will tell you that this is something that I just stumbled upon very recently in preparing for this talk. But we are curious to learn about all the lives that took place at Evergreen. And certainly if we can dig deeper into the story of the Broadbents and who was working in the house alongside them, we will certainly do so. Okay. Where were the stables? I'm going to close the Q&A and I'm going to scroll forward to the stable pictures again, and then I'll open up the Q&A back again. So the stables are, if you look at this image, they're right atop of my head, I think. So if you look all the way to the right side of the image, that little rectangular structure with the cupola, that was the original stables. And if you look at this last image, you can see that rectangular building with the cupola, and then the additions that the Garretts made to the stables in later years. It might be fun to do a whole talk just on the stables. And I think there's also a whole history of the workers who cared for the horses and the carriages that we could uncover by exploring those structures more. I understand that the property also had a gas plant and an electrical generating station. That is correct. I also believe that the property had a dairy at one point in time. And so we are eager to explore those stories as well. And when we learn more, we'll share that out. The Garrett family that lived at Evergreen did not own slaves because they lived at Evergreen after the Civil War. They moved into the house in 1878. Someone has thanked me for the presentation. And someone has asked me, will the upstairs ever be open? I want to bump back to one slide to answer a question about the upstairs that I didn't share, I don't think. So let me see if I can get back to another slide for all of you. Oh, I didn't share it because I took it out. So I had a slide in here that shows the, it's just a hallway that shows what the servants' quarters looked like under the second wing that was added by just Alice in 1905, 1906. And it's basically just a hallway. We use those former servants' rooms for collections today, and they are not open to the public. But I am contemplating perhaps some behind the scenes tours in the future. And that would certainly be an area to take people to help them understand how the whole house functioned and to shift some of those perspectives. Because right now, if you visit Evergreen, again, you're really seeing the house through the eyes of the Garretts. And I'm very interested in an opportunity to explore the history of the house through the eyes of the people who worked there. We have a question here. I'm a trustee of the Garrett Jacobs Mansion, and I've done some research on the Garrett family. I'm interested in learning about who owned the building. Was it the B&O Railroad or the Garrett family? If you're talking about Evergreen House, my understanding, and I could be wrong, was that John Garrett bought the house for his son, T. Harrison Garrett, and Alice Wittridge Garrett, his daughter-in-law. What's the relationship of the owners of the house to the donor of Hopkins Medical School? All right, T. Harrison Garrett and Mary Elizabeth Garrett were brother and sister. That's that relationship. Did the servants in the original house, 1858, live on the half floor above the second floor? That is what we think. I am also trying to get my head around how heavily populated that house was in 1858, because in addition to the 12 servants who are indicated as living there by the census also indicates that Stephen Broadbent and his wife lived there with their 11 children. So there was over 20 people living in that original house when it was first built. And I don't have a firm sense yet, and I may never have a firm sense of where everyone in that house lived. We do know that there were outbuildings on the property. There was the carriage house I mentioned, there was an ice house, there was a privy, and likely some other outbuildings as well. Can I describe the art and book collections in more detail? I can, but I'm not going to, because I really wanted to focus on architecture today. That said, I do like some self-promotion, so I'm going to hold up this lovely book. This is a book on Evergreen, and it explores in beautiful photographic detail the collections, both in terms of furniture, paintings, and books. Also, if you go on, I was going to say if you can go on our website, we're actually transitioning our website. But if you go onto the Sheridan Library's website, you can explore the Evergreen collection digitally there as well. I'm going to leave my email at the end of this chat, and I'm happy to answer further questions about the collection that way as well. Between 1858 and 1878, what space was used as the dining room? All right, that's an excellent question from one of our docents. So from what I understand, there is a space now in the Evergreen Museum that is a yellow dining room, and that was the original dining room. And when the expanded dining room, which was now the reading room, was constructed, that became a breakfast room. And then when the second generations of Garretts took the dining room with the big chandelier and all that Moorish furniture and turned it into a reading room, they turned the original dining room, which had been a breakfast room, back into a dining room. All right. In an early slide, I showed the 3 additions to the back of the house. One feature is the enclosed porch that is very common in homes in Roland Park, Waverly, and Edna Gardens. Any idea if the Garretts popularized this kind of porch or if they adapted the style porch after seeing other homes in the area? I would say that that porch was adapted from what other people were doing architecturally at the time. And I say that for a few reasons. That was the back of the house. That was a service area. I think they were less concerned with style and more concerned with functionality. And as I said, that whole kind of mishmash back of the house is a good example of it really being the functional side of the house. I would also say that the Garretts were not trendsetters. Nothing in the architecture of this house was considered avant-garde for its time. They were following popularly existing Victorian styles. And as I mentioned early on in that first slide, and I can go back to it here, or one of those early slides, whoops, uh-oh. All right, I think my slides vanished. So if I had gone back to that earlier slide that you would have seen, that they were really just, I just want to try, if you could bear with me, I want to try and get, there we go. Bear with me one second. I would like to try and answer that question. Thank you for your patience. All right, so if we go back to this slide again, you can see that they're following all, and including the broadbents, they're following all of what were the common architectural styles of the time. They were not ahead of the curve by any means with the changes that they were making. Okay. I'm going to just make sure I'm covering all the slides here, all the questions that I have here. Okay, someone asked for a little clarification. We have seen some rooms, but all. So if you go on a tour to the house, you do see some rooms, but not all. And certainly today, I only showed you a very few. Is there a burial ground on the original property? There is a pet cemetery on the original property, but there are no humans buried on the original property, as far as I know. Are there any plans to restore the gardens at Evergreen? We have, we work on our gardens on an ongoing basis. We don't have any plans to return them to the Victorian period. However, was there an elevator on the property? Yes, an elevator was added in 1900 when Alice Whitridge Garrett returned with her 3 sons to the house. And if you come on a tour of the house, you walk right through the elevator. It connects the 2nd floor to the 3rd floor. So someone had a question, were the servants in the typical ranks of a British house? Census does indicate a hierarchy of servants. It indicates cook, it does indicate butler, and then it does indicate domestic or servant. And then I got asked some questions about archaeological digs on the property, and I'm not sure about that. That is something to consider. So Jamie, Caroline, I know you're both still on here. Would you like me to keep going and answer a few more questions, or would you like to wrap it up?
If you want to answer more questions, by all means, go for it. We definitely have time, and I think it's fascinating.
All right, I'm going to try and answer a few more questions. Can you let me know, Jamie? It's hard to understand what you see. Do you see any slideshow? Do you see like my version of the slideshow, or do you see?
We see the front slide that says
Awesome.
An Outstanding Evergreen.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to open up a few more questions and see. Can you see the questions when I open them?
I can.
Okay, but we don't know if everyone else can. All right. Someone asked about the theater. So I will go back to my slides here, and the theater is shown here. It is a colorful room with the black floor down on the bottom, and the theater was a 20th century addition to Evergreen. So hopefully you'll come back and join us next week, same time, same station, where my colleague Amy Kimball and I will be discussing 20th century additions to Evergreen. Amy is a special collections manager at the Sheridan Libraries, and she is an expert on Lawrence Hall Fowler. The Lawrence Hall Fowler papers are at Evergreen, and we'll be thrilled to benefit from her expertise, and she'll talk quite a bit about the theater then. So come on back. I just got asked what the foundation was made of, and was there a wine cellar? And I'm just going to end on a note of ignorance. I don't have an answer to either of those questions, but now I'm curious to find out, especially about the wine cellar. I would imagine that there were all of the most modern accoutrements for kitchens at the time. And I didn't talk about the kitchen at all. And in fact, I didn't get into a lot of the details of what you see at the back of the house, but there were different versions of the kitchen over time. And certainly that is a space where you really can dig into a lot of different stories about how the house functioned as a workspace. And maybe when I do an inside tour of Evergreen, either virtually or in person, I can explore more, not just of the kitchen, but also of what the kitchen amenities were and how they changed over time. For example, I don't know if there was a root cellar. We do know about the ice house. And it would be also very interesting to know, even between 1858 and 1878, how some of those amenities changed. So I'm gonna do one more check of questions, and then I think I'm gonna sign off with a huge thank you to all of you for your interest and your patience with me. All right, I think I covered all the questions. I'm really grateful to everyone for joining us and listening today. It is a thrill to be able to share this information with you, both information that might be familiar to some of you and also information that we are still researching and frankly, in some cases, still vetting. So I'm glad to have you with me on this journey. I hope that when Evergreen reopens, you will come and visit us in person. I am starting to think of taking some of this content and developing it into some outside tours as well. And that is something I would love the opportunity to share with all of you. So thank you again. I've seen a few more questions hopped off. And Jamie, if it's okay with you, do you mind if I check just one more time?
Sure.
All right. All right, yes, so I'm gonna answer one more question that came in. Was there a reason for eliminating the bay windows, and is there a varied history on the uses made of the carriage house? Okay, so two questions. If you're talking about the bathroom bay windows, they were eliminated in two different time periods. They were eliminated, these two were taken out in 1933 when John Wirt Garrett and Alice Warder Garrett made interior bathroom changes to the house. So they took these off and they put new bathrooms on the inside. I have read that the other one on the north side of the house actually stayed on until the 1980s. And I think I have that there in my slide. It wasn't removed until 1982. So I'm curious to learn more about that. Do we know about different uses of the carriage house? We know a little bit about the carriage house. We know that there was dormers for living upstairs. And if you've never visited the carriage house, it's pretty extant. It's pretty much the way it was when the house was, when the house became Evergreen Museum and Library. The stables are still there. I think the hay lift is still there. It still very much looks like a carriage house. All right. Well, I'm now inspired to learn more about the carriage house and wine cellars and the foundation at Evergreen. I'm going to see if I can put I cannot put my email address in the chat, in the question and answer. So I'm just going to say it really slowly, and I'll go back to my name. I didn't have my name on here. Well, I am Lori Finkelstein. And my email address is lfinkelstein, Finkelstein. I think my name's probably there under my picture, at jhu.edu. That's lfinkelstein at jhu.edu. I've been the director of Evergreen for just a little over a year now, and I would love it if you sent me questions and also corrections or future avenues for research. I'm always looking to grow our narrative and our stories. I would be thrilled for anything that you might share with me. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Have a wonderful Tuesday evening, everyone. It was a pleasure to get to speak with you, and I look forward to your joining us next week when we explore the 20th century history of Evergreen. Thank you very much and have a great evening.